The desert in July was not a place that forgave weakness. By 8 in the morning, the air above Firebase Kestrel shimmered like the surface of a lake nobody could drink from. Heat pressed down on the corrugated rooftops of the prefabricated barracks, on the plywood walls of the briefing rooms, on the cracked asphalt of the vehicle lot where 3 MRAPs sat baking in silence. The mountains in the distance were the color of old bone. Nothing moved out there, nothing ever did, until it did, and then it was too late. Sergeant First Class Derek Woolner stood at the edge of the rifle range and squinted at the far berm. Behind him, 6 of the best marksmen in the 3rd Special Operations Detachment were running pre-qualification checks. He could hear the clean mechanical rhythm of bolts being cycled, the soft whisper of rifle slings adjusting, the brief terse exchanges of professionals who did not waste words. These were not boys. Every man on this range had a confirmed kill count that the Army preferred not to publish. Every man had been somewhere hot and come back, which was the only kind of resume that mattered out here. Woolner checked his watch. The 7th member of the unit was 20 minutes late. "She's not coming," said Corporal Travis Hensley, not looking up from his scope adjustment. Hensley was 26, broad across the shoulders, and had the particular confidence of someone who had never yet been proven wrong about anything important. His rifle, a Mach 22 multi-role anti-armor anti-personnel sniper system with a Night Force optic that cost more than most people's cars, lay across his lap like a sleeping animal. "Command sends us a female sniper the week before Kestrel sweep and expects us to what? Babysit?" Nobody answered him. Nobody needed to. "And nobody knows her unit," added Specialist Leon Ferris from 2 positions down. I ran the name. Claire Donahue. 0 operational record. Nothing in the system past 2019. "Ghost," said Hensley. He made the word sound like an insult. Woolner said nothing. He'd gotten the order from Colonel Raymond Baird himself, which meant the order did not invite discussion. Integrate Donahue into the element for Kestrel Suite. Full operational inclusion. That was all. No background file, no performance jacket, not even a photograph. He heard the vehicle before he saw it, a dusty HMMWV with a cracked passenger mirror that pulled up to the range gate without ceremony. The driver, a young private who looked like he'd rather be somewhere else, hopped out and opened the rear door with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd been told to do a job and intended to finish it. The woman who stepped out was not what any of them expected. She was not tall, not commanding. She wore a field uniform that had been washed so many times the color had gone from olive drab to something closer to gray, with no unit patch, no rank tab visible at a distance, nothing that announced her. Her hair was pulled back tightly. Her face was lean and angular, the kind of face that gave nothing away. Not age, not emotion, not intention. She might have been 30. She might have been older. It was genuinely difficult to say. What she carried was the thing that stopped the range. One by one, the men noticed it. The rifle she unslung from her back was a bolt action, not unusual in itself, but it was old. Visibly, demonstrably, almost defiantly old. The stock had been refinished at some point, by hand, with what appeared to be a linseed oil treatment that had darkened the wood unevenly. The barrel showed the kind of fine surface patina that comes not from neglect but from decades of use in varied environments. The optic, a fixed power scope, was a model that had been discontinued sometime around the first Obama administration. Hensley stared at it for a full 3 seconds. Then he laughed. It was not a cruel laugh. It was the automatic, involuntary laugh of someone who has encountered something so far outside their expectations that the brain defaults to comedy as a processing mechanism. But it was a laugh, and it carried across the range, and 3 other men smiled in a way they probably would have denied if asked. Woolner walked to meet her. "Donahue, Sergeant Woolner." Her voice was level, not flat level. There was a difference. "You're late. Wind check." She said it the way someone might say it's Tuesday. Factual, unapologetic. She glanced past him at the far berm, then up at the pennant flag at the range's north corner, then at the mountains. Her eyes moved like someone reading a sentence. Woolner studied her for a moment. "Get set up. We run quals in 40 minutes. She nodded once, and moved toward an open position at the end of the firing line. Nobody offered to help her. Nobody made room in any particular hurry. Hensley watched her settle into position with the expression of a man watching someone assemble furniture, incorrectly patient, waiting for the inevitable failure, already composing the anecdote he'd tell later. She did not set up a spotting scope. She did not deploy a laser rangefinder or a Kestrel weather meter. She pulled a small green notebook from her chest pocket and a stubby pencil, wrote 3 numbers she'd apparently calculated in her head during the walk from the vehicle, and lay prone behind a rifle that looked like it belonged in a museum. "No rangefinder?" Ferris asked, genuinely curious. She didn't answer. Woolner watched her settle, and he felt something shift just slightly in the back of his assessment. He had been doing this long enough to know that performance had its own grammar. The way she lay down, the way her body distributed itself into the earth, the particular stillness she achieved within seconds, these were not the movements of someone who was trying. These were the movements of someone who had stopped trying years ago and had simply become. He said nothing. He walked back to the center of the range and waited. The wind came off the northwest ridge in slow pulses, the way it always did at this time of morning. The pennant flag lifted and dropped, lifted and dropped. Claire Donahue watched it and wrote nothing new in her notebook. Qualification at Firebase Kestrel was not a standard Army marksmanship test. Woolner had designed the course himself 2 years ago, and Colonel Baird had approved it with minimal modification. It ran at distances between 600 and 1,400 meters, with targets of varying size, some static and some moving, some obscured by terrain features that required the shooter to calculate holds from indirect angles. The top score recorded on the range belonged to Hensley. 94 out of 100 possible points, achieved on his third attempt, on a perfect morning with stable wind. He talked about it approximately once a week. The men ran the course in order. Hensley went first. He was exceptional. There was no honest way to say otherwise. He worked the MAC-22 with the smooth confidence of a man who had grown up with rifles and spent his adult life being paid to be better at them than anyone else. He called his own shots quietly, adjusted between engagements with minimal movement, and finished with 91 points in what was considered moderate wind. The other men applauded briefly, the compressed, professional acknowledgement of a peer performing well. Ferris shot 83. Staff Sergeant Marcus Blay shot 88. Two others, Jericho Cole and Wade Sutter, shot 79 and 85 respectively. Then it was Donahue's turn. She had been watching from her position the entire time. She had not moved much. Her eyes had tracked each engagement, but whether she was studying the targets or the shooters or the wind or something else entirely, nobody could tell. She moved to the start position and settled into her prone. The bolt action's action was smoother than it had any right to be. Hensley noticed that when she cycled it between shots, the sound was almost inaudible, the bolt traveling in its channel with the frictionless ease of something that had been worked thousands of times by the same pair of hands. She began. Her first string, at 600 meters, was clean 5 for 5. The group was tight enough to cause a brief silence on the range. Her second string, at 800 meters, produced 4 hits and 1 miss that came on the third round, shortly after the wind shifted unexpectedly from the northwest. She adjusted immediately for the fourth and fifth shots, and both connected. "Not bad," said Cole, meaning it neutrally. At 1,000 meters, she shot 3 for 5. 2 rounds drifted wide, not far wide, but wide enough to score 0. Her total at that point put her well behind Hensley. Hensley said nothing, but the slight relaxation of his jaw was visible. The last string, 1,400 meters, the most difficult engagement on the course, a target barely larger than a human torso, partially obscured by a fold in the terrain, requiring a shooter to calculate not just wind and distance but a hold based on the partial visibility of the target itself. It was the string that separated very good shooters from exceptional ones. A moving target had been added today, an innovation Woolner had introduced specifically for this qualification cycle. None of the other shooters had known about it. Hensley had missed it entirely. So had Blay. Ferris had clipped it. Donahue looked at the berm for a long moment. The target, a small orange square mounted on a track that moved it laterally at roughly 2 meters per second, was at the edge of visibility. In the scope she was using, it would appear perhaps the size of a thumbnail at arm's length. She looked at it without the scope first. Just her eyes. Woolner watched her do this and kept his face neutral. She fired. The round traveled 1,400 meters in just over a second and a half. The target stopped moving. The range safety officer at the berm radioed back. "Center hit. Moving target." Nobody laughed now. Hensley's jaw was fully set. He looked at Donahue the way a man looks at something he has just realized he was wrong about, and finds he doesn't quite know what to do with the information. Donahue's final score was 81 below Hensley, below Blay. Technically, she ranked 4th on the range, but the center hit on the moving target at 1,400 meters without a rangefinder, on a discontinued fixed-power scope, in moderate to variable wind. That was not a score. That was a statement. Woolner walked to her as she stood and began, automatically, to check the rifle's action. "How did you calculate the moving target?" he asked. "No data, no meter." She looked at him for a moment. Then, "There's a drainage culvert on the northwest slope. When wind hits it, the sound changes. Frequency drops. That tells me direction and approximate speed. I've been listening since 0800. Woolner looked at the distant slope. There was, indeed, a culvert. He had never thought about its acoustic properties. He walked away and said nothing to anyone, but when he reached his position, he opened his own notebook and wrote one line. Kestrel sweep had been 3 weeks in the planning. The objective was a cluster of buildings in a district known informally as the grid, abandoned warehouses and factory shells on the southwestern fringe of what had once been an industrial development, now a network of sheltered positions used by a mobile command element that had been evading air surveillance for 6 months. Intelligence estimated 12 to 15 armed personnel. Possibly a communications hub, possibly something worse. The complication was the grid's electronic environment. Woolner laid it out in the briefing room 2 nights before the mission. The map on the table showed a dense arrangement of structures, and overlaid on it were 3 overlapping circles in red. "Signal suppression," he said. 3 separate jammers, positions estimated here, here, and here. GPS is unreliable within 2 kilometers. Laser rangefinders produce inconsistent results scattering off surface interference, we think. Drone feeds go dark at approximately 800 meters. Any targeting system that communicates electronically is compromised. He paused. Thermal optics remain functional. Wind meters are analog. Analog watches. Traditional ballistic holds. Another pause. Everything you learned before the equipment did the thinking for you. There was a silence in the room. "I'm not running this without our optics," said Hensley. His voice was not insubordinate, it was the voice of a man stating a professional concern. "We strip the electronic advantages, we're shooting blind at distance." "Not all of us," said Ferris quietly, and everyone knew what he meant without looking at Donahue, who sat at the end of the table with her notebook open and her hands flat on the surface. Woolner did not address the implication directly. "We adapt. We use overlapping observation. We identify positions before we engage. We take nothing for granted." He looked around the table. "Any questions about the route?" Hull raised a concern about the approach timeline. Sutter asked about the extraction window. The conversation moved through the operational details with the focused professionalism that these men could produce even when they were worried, because worry and professionalism had learned to coexist in them over years of practice. After the briefing broke, Ferris found himself walking beside Donahue toward the barracks. "You've worked in jammed environments before," he said. It was not exactly a question. She didn't answer immediately. After a moment, "Yes, where?" She glanced at him. "Not unkindly. Somewhere that doesn't have a name in any document you've read." He nodded slowly. That answer, in its own way, was more informative than a set of coordinates. "When our stuff stops working," he said carefully, "what do you actually fall back on?" She considered the question as if she were giving it genuine respect. "Pattern," she said finally. "Everybody has a pattern. The way they breathe, the way they move before they move. Technology helps you confirm, but if you're patient enough, you can see what's coming before the equipment registers it." She paused. Most people stopped being patient when the machines got fast enough to do it for them. Ferris walked the rest of the way in silence. He thought about that for a long time afterward. They moved at 0330, 6 personnel. Woolner on command and rifle, Hensley and Cole as primary shooters, Blay on rear security, Ferris on comms and observation, and Donahue, her role on the team sheet listed simply as support, observation, which told anyone reading it almost nothing. The grid was quiet when they arrived. It was always quiet in the way that places hold their breath, not truly empty, but withholding. The first sign of trouble came 11 minutes after they'd established their primary hide. Hensley's rangefinder produced a reading of 340 meters to the target building's eastern entrance. He ranged it a second time, 510 meters. A third, 290 meters. He set the device down without speaking. Cole, 2 meters to his left, was watching his drone feed collapse to static. The small unit buzzed once, lost signal, and went dark in his hand. "Jammers are live," Woolner said, voice barely above a breath. He had expected this. They all had. Expecting something and experiencing it were, as always, different. Donahue was lying prone to Woolner's right. She had opened her notebook and was writing small, steady notations, numbers, and abbreviated symbols that Ferris, watching from behind, couldn't entirely decode. She was looking at the buildings and then at the sky, and then at a patch of disturbed dust near the eastern wall of the largest structure. And writing, the pencil moving in small, quiet strokes. "I've got heat signature," Blay said from rear security, his thermal scope still functional. 2 on the roofline, north building. 2 more, ground level, eastern approach. "Can you range them?" "Negative. Thermals visual only." Silence. The wind was coming from the south. Low velocity. It would not stay that way. Then one of them moved. Corporal Jericho Cole shifted his position to get a better sightline on the northern roofline, and the movement, small as it was, a slight repositioning of body weight that displaced loose gravel, was enough. A shot came from somewhere in the structure's western face, not a suppressed round, an unsuppressed 7.62 that cracked across the open ground and punched through the low concrete lip Cole was using as cover. The round missed him by 14 inches. Cole pulled back, his breathing suddenly audible. "Contact west," Woolner said. "Position?" Nobody had a position. The shot had come from within the structures, through a gap nobody had identified. No muzzle flash visible in the pre-dawn darkness. The sound had bounced off 3 surfaces before it reached them, making triangulation through conventional means nearly useless. Hensley was searching. His eye was pressed to the night force optic, sweeping the western face methodically, trying to find the human gap in the structure's darkness. He found nothing. Another shot. This one from the north building's roofline, targeting the position where Blay's thermal signature had given away minimal movement. It hit the ground 2 meters short. "They're adjusting," Woolner said. "They know our approximate position." Donahue had not moved. Her eyes were on the western face of the large structure. She was watching something or for something. Her right hand lay along the rifle's action. Her breathing was slow and rhythmic and barely visible. "Donahue," Woolner said. She held up one finger. The universal gesture, "Forgive me a moment." He gave it to her. She watched. 30 seconds passed, which felt much longer. Ferris could hear his own heartbeat. Cole was pressed into the dirt with his jaw set and his eyes closed, recalibrating. Blay was still, the thermal scope pressed to his face. Then Donahue's finger lowered. Her hand closed gently around the grip. She did not shoot from the primary hide. Woolner realized this only after it happened. She had repositioned herself 8 meters to the right during the 30-second pause, moving so gradually, so incrementally, that the human eye had simply not registered it as movement. She had used the natural drift of their attention, all of them scanning the buildings, to redistribute herself across the ground like something that had always been there. The suppressor on her rifle was not a modern unit. It was machined from a material Ferris couldn't identify, dense, matte, and showing the same hand-worked finish as the rest of the rifle. He had not noticed it during the qualification because it had not been attached then. She fired. The sound was not silence. Suppressors did not produce silence. Anyone who had been near a truly suppressed shot knew that. The actual sound was more like someone hitting a hardwood door sharply with the flat of their hand. A percussive thump that traveled maybe 30 meters before the desert air swallowed it. At 700 meters, inside the western structure, a man who had been lining up his third shot slumped backward and did not get up. Nobody on Woolner's team heard a return shot. Nobody heard a cry. Nobody heard anything except, after a moment, the wind resuming its low movement across the flat ground. What Cole started. "Down," Woolner said. 40 seconds passed. Another sound from Donahue's position, the bolt cycling, the soft click of a fresh round chambering, the silence that followed. She had moved again. 3 meters, same incremental dissolution. The roofline of the north building. 2 figures that Blay's thermal scope had tracked. They were moving now, shifting position, perhaps repositioning in response to the loss of their partner to the west. This was a tactical mistake. Moving drew the eye. Moving drew other things. Donahue fired a second time. One of the roofline figures stopped moving. The second one froze. Absolute stillness, the animal stillness of a creature that has suddenly realized it is being hunted and does not know from which direction. This was the worst kind of stillness to hold because the body's instinct was always to run. And the mind knew that running was what got you seen, and the conflict between those two imperatives locked a person in place for the 3 or 4 seconds it took for the situation to resolve itself. It resolved itself. The second roofline figure went down. Woolner looked at Ferris. Ferris looked back at him. Neither of them said anything. What would have been the appropriate thing to say? That they had just watched a woman with a discontinued rifle and a handmade suppressor remove 2 threats from a roofline at distance, in low light, against jammers that had neutralized every piece of equipment they'd brought. Inside 40 seconds, there was no appropriate response to that. Cole had turned and was staring at Donahue's position with an expression that had moved cleanly through surprise and was now somewhere in the vicinity of recalibration. She had already moved again. Inside the complex, in a room on the ground floor of the largest structure, a man named in the intelligence files as Subject 12 was listening. He had been doing this job for 4 years. He was not a boy. He understood how firefights began, how they escalated, how they ended. He had a communications device that was currently producing static, and he had 8 armed personnel in and around these buildings, and he had been told that the grid of electronic suppression they deployed made them invisible and untouchable to any conventional targeting system. He heard the first shot, or rather he did not hear a shot. He heard Vasquez, in the western passage, stop talking mid-sentence through the earpiece. And then nothing. He keyed the radio. Vasquez. Static. He looked at the man beside him, corporal of his own irregular formation, a man who'd survived 7 engagements across 2 different conflicts. That man was already reading the situation. His face said the same thing. Subject 12's face said, "Someone is out there, and we cannot see them." The second and third kills came within 60 seconds. He didn't know they were kills, yet he knew that Reyes on the north roof had stopped responding, and then Torres had stopped responding, and both of these things had happened without any audible gunfire that he could identify as incoming. No crack of supersonic passage, no whip of a bullet through the air, nothing. He put 2 men on the eastern egress with instructions to move. They moved. One of them made it to the corner of the secondary building before something happened to him that his partner, 2 meters behind, witnessed but could not explain. There was no flash. There was no sound he could separate from the general ambient noise of desert darkness. His partner simply stopped existing as a standing, breathing problem and became something else. The partner stopped. He pressed himself against the wall. He was breathing in shallow, rapid cycles, now the body's emergency response to a threat it cannot classify. "Fall back," Subject 12 said into the radio, though he suspected the order was reaching nobody. "All units, fall back to the center." He stopped himself from finishing the sentence because falling back required movement, and movement was apparently what ended you. He stood very still and understood, for the first time in 4 years, what it felt like to be prey. The worst part, the part that would stay with him if he survived, the part that he would describe later in a debrief that was classified at a level that meant almost nobody would read, it was the silence, not the absence of his people, not the tactical deterioration of his position. The silence that came from outside, the patient, seamless, unannounced silence that preceded each event, gave no warning, offered no sound to track, no source to identify, no direction to face. You can defend against an enemy you can locate. You cannot defend against weather. Between the 4th and 5th engagements, there was a pause of approximately 6 minutes. Woolner used it to redistribute the team into better positions. Blay had established that 3 of the 12 estimated personnel were no longer mobile. Cole had moved to cover the southern approach. Hensley was watching the main structure's interior through a narrow gap in the corrugated wall with his thermal scope. During this pause, Ferris moved to Donahue's position. She was cycling the bolt slowly, clearing debris from the action with a small brush she produced from her vest pocket. The rifle lay across a flat rock she'd found and positioned without Ferris noticing, and she was working on it with the unhurried attention of a craftsperson inspecting familiar work. He crouched beside her, kept his voice very low. "That suppressor, what's it made of?" She glanced at him. "Aluminum, mostly. Machined yourself?" A pause. Then, 11 years ago, took 4 attempts to get the baffle design right. He absorbed this. The rifle itself, 1978 Sako TRGS platform. I've replaced the barrel 3 times. The action I've worked myself trigger break is around 300 grams. She paused. The stock is walnut. I refinished it in 2014. Ferris looked at the rifle with different eyes. He'd been looking at it as something old. He was now looking at it as something evolved, something that had been through decades of deliberate iteration in the hands of someone who understood every component at a molecular level. "Why no electronics?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. The brush moved along the action. "Because electronics teach you to trust the number, not the picture." She looked at the distant building. The number is always an approximation. The picture, what you actually see, the light, the air, the behavior of the target before it commits to movement, that's closer to the truth. A pause. When you have electronics, you stop developing the picture. The machine sees for you, and then when the machine stops working, you're blind. Ferris finished. She didn't confirm this. She didn't need to. He looked at his own rifle, with its suppressor and its ranging system and its ballistic calculator. He thought about what he would do right now if all of it went dark. He tried to be honest with himself about the answer, and the answer was not comfortable. "How long have you been training without it?" he asked. She thought about the question. 11 years, since the Sako. She looked at him. Something moved behind her eyes that she chose not to put into words. She went back to the brush and the action. But Ferris had been listening carefully, and he had noticed what she'd said versus what she hadn't. 11 years. A specific number. A starting point that correlated with a decision, not an accident. He didn't ask. He understood, dimly, the shape of it, that there was something that had happened 11 years ago that had produced a woman who spent a decade teaching herself to see without machines in a desert that no document named. He understood that this was not his territory. He moved back to his position, and he took with him the uncomfortable awareness that everything he relied on to do his job could be taken from him in a moment by a machine the size of a suitcase, and that the woman 30 meters away had spent 11 years making sure that could never happen to her. The story had never been filed in any report that anyone in this unit would have access to, but it existed. The way things that shape a person always exist, not in documents, but in the particular way they move, the specific things they will and will not say, the professional decisions that look idiosyncratic until you know what produced them. In 2013, Claire Donahue had been 24 years old and a member of a 6-person reconnaissance element operating in a region that, per official record, they were not in. The mission had run for 11 days. On the 12th day, a contact assessment went wrong, not due to faulty intelligence, not due to command error, but due to a cascading equipment failure that the after-action review had politely described as unexpected performance degradation under sustained operational conditions. Her spotting scope had failed. Her partner's ranging system had produced data 23 meters short of actual distance. She had fired based on her partner's data and missed. The round had gone wide by a margin that, under normal circumstances, would have been inconsequential. Under these circumstances, it had been enough to alert a position they had not known existed. What followed had taken less than 4 minutes and had ended with 3 of the 6 element members dead and 2 more wounded seriously enough to leave the profession. Claire Donahue had walked out of that location without a scratch, which was the kind of thing that followed a person differently than being wounded. The dead received grief. The unscratched received something more complicated. The after-action review had concluded that equipment failure under sustained operational stress was a known risk and that no individual had acted improperly. This finding had been made in a comfortable room by people whose equipment had not failed that day, and it had not resolved anything for her. She had spent 2 months in a standard post-incident evaluation. She had answered all the questions correctly. She had been cleared for return to operational duty. She had not returned to operational duty. Not immediately. not for the reasons they thought. She had taken her Sako to a workshop she'd been using since she was 18, and she'd put it on the bench and looked at it for a long time. And then she'd begun. The spotting scope she left on the bench. She didn't throw it out, she just left it there, and after a while she stopped seeing it. She ranged by eye. She calculated wind by sound and surface behavior. She read targets by the accumulation of tiny behavioral signals that preceded movement by fractions of a second. She missed constantly at first, constantly and badly. She kept notes. She adjusted. She went back 11 years. Approximately 40,000 rounds through the rebuilt barrel. 3 barrels total. She returned to operational duty in 2016 through a channel that involved a colonel who owed a general a favor, and whose records were maintained in a classification level that made her, for most practical purposes, invisible. She had not told anyone the story. She had never needed to. The work told it. Tonight it was telling it clearly enough. The last push came at 0512 when the eastern sky was showing the very first suggestion of gray. Intelligence had underestimated. There were not 12 to 15 personnel in the grid. There were 19. The remaining 8, those who had not been engaged by Donahue in the first phase, were falling back to the large central structure, consolidating. They had communication among themselves, even if their long-range systems were down, and they had, apparently, made the assessment that the safest direction of movement was toward the southern approach, where Woolner's element was thinnest. Cole saw them coming on thermal. 8 contacts, southern approach, moving fast. Woolner made the call. Donahue, primary engagement. Everyone else, secondary coverage. Do not fire unless you have a confirmed clear shot. Hensley, to his credit, did not argue. What happened in the next 11 minutes was not clean. Clean was for the debriefs, for the after-action reports, for the language that transformed the brutal arithmetic of violence into prose that could be filed in a folder and placed on a shelf. What happened was fast and close, and 3 times the situation almost went a different way, and the difference each time was a fraction of a second, and a choice made by someone who had spent 11 years becoming capable of making it. Donahue shot from 4 different positions. The team learned something that morning about how a person can move not quickly, but silently, in a way that made quickly seem like the wrong standard. She moved like water finding a new channel, like pressure redistributing itself, like something that occupied space and then did not, without the gap between those two states being clearly observable to the naked eye. She was not superhuman. This needs to be stated clearly. On the 4th engagement, she fired and missed. The round struck the building's corner and produced a spark that gave away her position for approximately 3 seconds. 3 seconds was enough. Incoming fire forced her flat, and she rolled left and behind a concrete fragment and waited, her breathing controlled but her body registering what her face would not show. It was Hensley who covered her.